So if you're a student and you want to sort of classify what came from the Prophet ﷺ, you got the Quran, right? So that was a direct revelation, which was exactly recorded and memorized as it was uttered. The second is the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ. Third is the actions, and fourth is approvals, meaning you've got, like, for example, the Prophet ﷺ woke up in the morning and he went to sleep at night, right? And he ate and he walked and he prayed salat and he went for Hajj and he would, perform, certain actions, maybe in the battlefield or at home, whatever. So these actions and approvals would be things that he saw in the community that were done and didn't rebuke them. And this is considered to be also be important because as a prophet, the Prophet ﷺ would not be allowed to stay silent on anything that was against Islam, against the teachings of Allah in the community. So anything that happened that was against the teachings of Allah, he had to speak up against it. This is part of the mission of the Prophet ﷺ. However, from all of this, I've drawn like a little pie chart over here. The red part represents the sayings. So only a fraction of the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ were actually recorded, right? They were like written down or passed down through memory. A vast majority were not. So you got 23 years of life as the Messenger ﷺ. How many things did he say? Must have been lots. How many, how many statements, how many people did he speak to? He must have addressed large audiences. He must have addressed his family members. He must have addressed companions. He must have addressed the enemies. All sorts of statements you can imagine. But from this, only a fraction has actually been passed down to us, right? From the narrations. So this brings us to the issue of Umar bin Abdul Aziz. So Umar bin Abdul Aziz, he was roughly, if you remember the first slide I showed you with the timeline, he roughly came in the 90 years after the Prophet ﷺ. He was a Khalifa for 2 years only, roughly in the year 100. So he saw the problem of Sahaba dying, and with Sahaba dying, you've got like basically a university dying, right? Each Sahabi was basically a university. And with every university, you got a whole library that's just dying. And he realized that if we don't address this now, what's going to happen is we're going to be left with a fraction of knowledge. And the people who come in the future will have no context behind their religion, right? They're going to lose out on all this information. So what he decided to do a compilation. So if you look at the screen, I've done the word sunnah 3 times. And then I've drawn some nice arrows going towards 3 different things. So the first one, the top, represents the sunnah in recorded form, right? So this was basically where, the sunnah was the explanation of the Quran in that way. The second is sunnah in hadith form, meaning transmitted statements. And the third is sunnah in practice, right? So the practice that existed. So you got sunnah in the way basically of the explanation of the Quran that was done. Number 2 is sunnah in as a form of report or reports, right, that were passed down. Like I've drawn the truck there. So imagine like trucks just carrying cargo. So the narrators were acting as these trucks. They were passing information, large quantity of information, passing it on to other people. It was like this whole transfer of knowledge was taking place, literally like trucks, passing down information. The third one is interesting. The third one is actually where the sunnah was preserved in the community, in the practice of the Sahaba and the Tabi'in. So this would be where things like, if you go for Hajj, you're not really going to get a mistake in Hajj because there are so many people who are going Hajj, and they've learned it from so many people, that you definitely know the Prophet ﷺ had done this. Things like Salat as well. Everyone, when they go into ruku, they bow down. You go into prostration 5 times a day and all that, right? So these are like sunnahs which were embodied or embedded in the society itself, right? So this was the widespread sunnah. And this is interesting because this is what the early generation considered this to be more important than anything else, right? The living sunnah in the lives of the Sahaba and the Tabi'in. This was what was considered to be, like an example was where Imam Malik rahimahullah, he basically, someone came to him and brought a narration to him and said, look, Imam Malik, you don't act upon this narration, right? And Imam Malik looked at the man and said, look, he said, I have seen this practice that I practice being done by the children of the Sahaba, and they've got it from their parents. Are you telling me that hundreds of people who are practicing this particular practice, which was placing the hands and the sides, right, and not folding them? He goes, I see this in Medina with my teachers, and they're the children of the Sahaba, and they got it from their parents. Are you telling me that's wrong? Hundreds of people learning from hundreds of people. And the others, and you're bringing me this one narration that contradicts this action. What should I do? What do you think I should do? What's logical? Do you want me to take the practice of the people of Medina and leave the hadith, or do you want me to leave the hadith and leave the practice of hundreds of people? So this now became, the idea of sunnah now became something that was debated now. How do we understand the sunnah, right, when it comes to fiqh? So Umar bin Abdul Aziz, he actually took the first two types and he began to compile them. Right? So he actually deputed several famous muhaddithin, and they were actually paid by the government to actually go to all these major cities that we mentioned in the beginning and to meet up with the living Sahaba or Tabi'in and to record as many reports as they could. So this action, it started the ball rolling with the hadith trend, right? Hadith collection. This is what happened. Although even before hadith collection, the sunnah was already in the society, right? People already knew how to pray. People already knew how to fast. Everything was there already. So the hadith collection isn't really going to change anything, right? Rather, what the hadith collection is going to do is it's going to act as a defense mechanism to stop anything that is not part of the deen from falling into it, right? That's what it was intended for. Okay, so this is why scholars became very strict when it came to writing of hadith, right? Why were they strict? Because there was a fear of fabrication, right? There was a clear fear that people are going to fabricate, and like I'll show you a bit later. They were actually really kind of, you can say people that had very nefarious intentions, or whatever intention they had, Allah knows best. But fabrication is something that is like toxic to knowledge itself. So when it comes to like any science, fake news, fake information is always dangerous. We know that today a lot, and the same thing happens over here. So they didn't want that. So they were very strict, and codification was, the utmost. Number two, no context. So you could have a hadith and there's no context to it, and people have no idea what the hadith is referring to. And this has happened on many occasions, right? Because remember, imagine it with your notes, like your university lecture in the beginning of the year, you've written down some notes and you haven't gone back to those notes again. And then someone else reads your notes and is trying to figure out, what have you written? What's happening over here? What's being said? Number three is flexibility of ijtihad. In other words, strictness in hadith, it allowed ijtihad to flourish. Because if you're strict in hadith, it means you're not going to be accepting the bandwidth of hadith that you're going to be accepting is going to be very limited. So therefore, when it comes to ijtihad, there's going to be more emphasis on people using their judicial, skills of ijtihad to be able to come to a conclusion. And this is why we see in this era, this Tabi'in era, this whole, abundance of ijtihad taking place. Many, many scholars presenting their findings. Finally, hadith given same status as Quran. Right? That was one of the fears initially, and then that ceased. That the Prophet ﷺ, he banned Sahaba from writing his statements because he didn't want it to be mixed with the Quran. Anyway, themes and meanings of narrations now. So one of the things that was interesting that I found was Ali radiallahu anhu's statement, which he actually said to people, narrate to people that which they recognize and leave that which they don't recognize. Very interesting that Ali radiallahu anh knew that, do we really need to convey all the hadith to the people? Do people really need to know all hadith? Meaning, is the religion deficient and we need to find all the hadith to complete the religion, or is the religion complete? Like we mentioned last session, Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum, we've completed your religion for you. And the Sahaba were left in the complete understanding of Islam. Right? The Prophet ﷺ, he left them, Sahaba understood Islam, and there was nothing missing. So Ali radiallahu anh said, only tell people those things that they can understand, right? Don't try to tell things that people can't understand, right? Because this he says in the rest of the narration is quite long. He says, do you want Allah and His Messenger to be rejected? Meaning, you might narrate something that the Prophet ﷺ said or did, but the context behind that has all been omitted. And there's just like one line from the whole sort of like book, only one line has been quoted. And that one line confuses you about the Prophet ﷺ. It confuses you about what he said. He makes you think the Prophet ﷺ would never say that. He'd never do that. An example of this would be, for instance, like the Prophet ﷺ, he said, when you walk down the road and you see Jews and Christians, he said, push them to one side. So, how would the Prophet ﷺ, he's rahmatul lil alameen, he's mercy to mankind, and in Sahih Muslim, this narration is there, that if you see the Jews and Christians, push them to one side. So the commentators say that this statement was actually said in the situation of hostility. There was extreme hostility towards Muslims in the early part of Medina from the Jews, right? So this is the Muslims. There's like cases where like people, an incident took place where a Muslim woman came to buy something, and one of the Jews, what he done was he took the peg of the tent and he placed it like behind her dress, like people do when they take their laces, someone's laces unknowingly, and tie them together to make them trip. So he's placed this peg inside of her dress. She's walked away and she's become nude. And in front of everyone, she's been embarrassed. And these are the kind of like things that they try to do against Muslims. And it's been documented in Hadith, the Banu Qurayza incident and the Banu Qaynuqa incident and others. So the Prophet ﷺ, instead of telling the Sahaba, look, don't be afraid of walking down the street. Be confident, walk down. And if they push you to one side, you push them to one side. Right? Don't be afraid. So this is why we have to understand like lots of background to Hadith. And the preserved Sunnah in the lives of the Sahaba, it makes more sense to take that, because that was actually something which was practiced and it was accepted by the wider community. Okay, so those who are permitted to narrate now, had to have high reliability, right? They had to be really reliable. And number two is they had to have understood the context of every narration. Now, this was in the early generation. It was like, do you know what you're narrating? Do you really understand what you're narrating? Okay. This brings us to the next issue, which is when narrations were being narrated, narrations were either narrated word for word or they were narrated in meaning. Now, you'd be surprised. Majority of the narrations that we have in existence are not the exact words of the Prophet ﷺ. They are basically the words of the Prophet ﷺ or the meanings from the Prophet ﷺ in the words of the narrators. So, for example, like if you look on the right-hand side, actions are only by intentions. Famous hadith you've heard of, right? إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. The only Sahabi who has narrated this hadith is Umar radiallahu anhu, only one Sahabi, yeah? And he teaches it to others, but only one person has recorded taking this hadith from him, yeah, Alqama. And Alqama, only one person has been narrated taking this hadith from Muhammad ibn Ibrahim. So you got one Sahabi and only one student has been reported taking this hadith. And so you have 20 versions of this hadith. How can you have 20 versions of this hadith, different wordings, when the only companion that narrated this was Umar? So did the Prophet ﷺ say this hadith to Umar 20 different times with 20 different wordings? That's very unlikely. That seems very, very far-fetched. The only explanation would be that when people began to narrate this to their students, they would narrate it in meaning, right? And they weren't very particular about the exact words. However, certain hadith we know have been preserved word for word, most likely. Like, for example, the famous hadith, dua is the essence of worship. So the dua is essence of worship. This is like what they call the jawami al-kalim, like really kind of like comprehensive hadith, which the wording as well, it's very sort of like a rhyming wording as well. So what I found was there's actually 3 types of narrations that are word for word. The supplications, right, and adhan. So dua, like dua is when you eat food, or when you go to sleep, or when you go for hajj, or when you leave your house, when you mount a vehicle. Adhan, the words of the adhan, we know these are the exact ones that the Prophet ﷺ narrated. And number 2 is letters and treaties that were written to various people in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, those that are still preserved today. those are the exact words because, those are the exact, obviously, copies. And number 3, short narrations from the Jawami al-Kalim. Right, so Jawami al-Kalim simply means those short, snappy, like phrases the Prophet ﷺ said, which held lots of deep meaning inside of it. Like you might have heard some of them. For instance, like religion is wanting good for your brother, or the world is a prison for the believer. So these kind of are like most likely are the exact words of the Prophet ﷺ. So majority of narrations that we have now are not the exact words of the Prophet ﷺ. They are the meaning, right, that has been projected. So there were companions who actually allowed narration by meaning, and I've listed on the screen. These are some of the names for this. And there were companions who were totally against it. They were very strict on the exact wording. And these are some of the names of companions who were for this. So you have 2 camps now. You got 2 camps of companions. One camp is saying you have to narrate the exact words, and one camp is saying no, you don't have to narrate the exact words because the religion has been preserved, and these are like just adding extra, enhancing what we already have. Okay, so tabi'in who were for and against as well, right? So on the blue one are those tabi'in who were for, narrating with meaning, and on the right hand side, Qasim ibn Sirin, Raja bin Haywa, they were against. They said no, you had to narrate the hadith exactly word for word. Okay, and these were like prominent tabi'in. These are not like small tabi'in. They're very, very prominent tabi'in, senior tabi'in. But anyway, we can see there is a clear difference of opinion regarding this. Okay, so variations in wording of hadith. So how do variations in wording of hadith, like for many people, I'm sure many of you guys are not very familiar with the science of hadith and the nature of varying narrations. So I listed for you guys some of the differences in how words differ. For example, number 1, difference in order of words. Like let's say, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that order. That same hadith in another version might occur as A, C, B, D, E, F, G, right? With a shuffling of a few words here and there. Number 2, subtraction of letters of conjunction, right? So sometimes what happens is you might have like wows missing or fas missing, right? Some types of words. Substitution of a letter for other letters. So one letter is substituted for another letter, but it preserves the overall meaning. Pronunciation of vowels, right? So pronunciation of vowels. So this also, I'll show you an example of this a bit later. Substitution of words with other similar words. Like for example, the hadith of innamal a'malu binniyat. You might have heard some versions say that فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى دُنْيَا يُصِيبَ أَوْ إِمْرَأَةٍ يَتَزَوَّجُهَا. And in one version, إِمْرَأَةٍ يَنْكِحُهَا. يَتَزَوَّج and يَنْكِح, 2 different words, but roughly same meaning. And abbreviation of a long narration. This is very common. So there's like a long narration. Some companions have shortened the narration into a short abridged version of it, and others have left the longer version. Okay. Now, an example of this is difference in wording. There's 2 hadith now. One's in Abu Dawud, one's in Ibn Majah. The hadith is basically about praying the janazah, the funeral of a person in a masjid, inside a masjid. Right? Can you pray a janazah inside a masjid or not? So the Abu Dawud hadith says that whoever prays the janazah of a person inside a masjid, nothing is upon him. And nothing is upon him means like it's fine, right? No problem. In Ibn Majah, it says nothing is for him. Slight difference between lahu and alayhi. That's all. It's 2 words changed, but now the meaning changes. Nothing is for him means there's no reward for him. So this is why some of the scholars differ in the ruling of now, can you pray the janazah of a person inside the masjid, right? Or not? And in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we don't really have any record, authentic narration of the Prophet ﷺ praying the janazah of a person inside the masjid. He in fact built an area adjacent to the masjid, which was for janazahs. So that's why this issue is raised. This is an example of, it's been messed up. So that circle is actually supposed to be on top of that dhamma over there. So yeah, this is what happens, technology. Yeah, so that, imagine that circle is slightly shifted towards the red one is supposed to be on the dhamma, zakatu, with the dhamma, and the blue one is supposed to be zakata, fatha. Yeah, but anyway. So this hadith basically is this. You know, if you have like a cow, right? And the cow has a fetus, and the fetus is almost born. It's almost ready. It's gonna to give birth. But a person was to slaughter the mother, right? The cow. And they cut open the cow and they take the fetus out. Do they have to then repeat the slaughtering on the calf as well? So they slaughtered the mother. Do they have to slaughter the calf to make it halal? Or is the mother sufficient? You slaughter the mother and then everything inside the mother automatically becomes halal. Yeah, how is it? So the first hadith says, Zakatul janini, the slaughtering of the fetus is the slaughtering of the mother. Meaning, you don't have to slaughter the fetus. Once you slaughter the mother, it is the slaughtering of the mother. And the blue one says, Zakatul janini, the slaughtering of the fetus is like the slaughtering of its mother. Very subtle difference. One's got a dhamma, one's got a fatha, right? But the meaning changes. So this is why there's a difference of opinion now amongst the later scholars about, okay, how do we deal with this situation?